Welcome to Burning Platforms, our regular look at the politics of technology brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week we draw a line through 2025 with regular panellists, Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. Joining us is long-term platform burner, Human Technology Institute co-director Ed Santow. We'll chart the highs, the lows and ponder what comes next. Hope you enjoy the discussion. Well, welcome to the final Burning Platforms of 2025. It's great to have our regular team in the room. Lizzie O'Shea, Chair of Digital Rights Watch. Thanks for coming along, Lizzie.
Thanks for having me, as always.
Dan Stinton, CEO of Health Engine. Thanks for being here, Dan.
G'day, Peter. G'day, Lizzie.
And not so much a guest, but someone that we like dropping into just because he's part of the family, the co-director of the Human Technology Institute out of UTS, Ed Santow. Ed, great to have you along.
Yeah, I'm part of the irregular team. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Mate, you're on the bench whenever. Listen, we thought we'd do something a bit different as our final episode and just sort of look back on the year, highlights, lowlights, what's going to happen in the future and what we're going to do over summer. So it's going to be a bit looser than normal, but really keen, I think, particularly, Ed, for your take on the National AI Plan that was released a couple of weeks ago. I feel like that's one where we're going to have some good different perspectives. Also, we should note we're recording this 24 hours after the attacks in Bondi. And it sort of, I feel like while it's way too early for any sort of hot takes, it does, I feel like, cast a pall in a context on the year that's going to play out over the summer. Our friend Cam Wilson, writing on his fantastic site, Sizzle today, just noted going online in 2025 just means being blasted with the most horrific content you can imagine. Being traumatized is just the cost of entry. I feel like, I don't know if it, and I'm interested in anyone's initial thoughts on this, but it does feel like these big events can shape a whole year and shape the way we make sense of it all. But I know, Ed, you're in Sydney as well. Any thoughts on what this does to the broader discussions we'll be having this evening?
I just feel really sad. I'm sure I could try and muster something more profound than that. I'm Jewish by background. None of my family was caught up in the shootings. And I can just see how we've seen this too many times in the past. We've seen a community be targeted, and then there's often this massive kind of backlash and overreaction, and it's terrible for all the communities of Australia. So I'm really hoping that doesn't happen this time, but I'm bracing myself for that.
Yeah, I was kind of feeling sad about the year before that, but I do feel that intense sense of just the heaviness now. Lizzie?
Yeah, I agree. I am just a bit worried about the somewhat inevitable politicisation of this. And yeah, it is a tragedy. I'm just really hoping we can get to a point where people aren't being victimised on the basis of their religion and origin. And I remain a bit concerned that there may be a tendency towards looking at ways in which you can better surveil people to prevent these things. And I think how we investigate this and what we decide to do as a result of what we find is going to be really important.
Mm-hmm. History will say that so much of the tech that we are now, the reality of where tech went was shaped by 9/11 and the responses to that. I don't know where that takes us. I don't know if you've got anything you want to contribute, Dan, before we get into the year.
I don't know what else can be said. When I'm in Sydney, I stay in Bondi. It was all very familiar. I have a very large circle of Jewish friends. Some of them were caught up in it there yesterday. I probably just share Cam's sentiment. I spent most of last night seeing videos on various social media platforms that I wish I hadn't seen. That wouldn't have been possible a few years ago. I'd really love to find a way back there, but I don't know what's going to go from here.
Yeah. Thanks for that, guys. Well, let's get into the year that was the year before December 14, and obviously the one that will be known as 2025. Start off with highlights. What went right this year for those of us that care about a world where we've got some sort of control and agency over technology? Lizzie, have you got a highlight for the year?
I do have a highlight for the year. I think it's somewhat of a defensive win. I think that's how you described it, Ed, when we spoke about it. But there was a push in Australia, a strong push by the tech industry to facilitate a text and data mining exemption for large language models, for AI models that train on text. And in the UK, at least, this has been progressed. You know, the tech industry has gotten access to copyrighted materials for this purpose, and there was a real concern that Australia might follow suit. This was a big push from the industry body. And what we saw in reaction to that was a strong pushback by copyright holders, lots and lots of creatives who make content that then has been used in training AI, often overseas, because there are fewer protections in other parts of the world where these models are often trained. And I think it was a really rapid mobilisation of people to say, oh, it's not fair that large companies can seek to make use of this creative content to train their models to produce a product that they then sell and benefit from. We're in a world in which creatives work really hard and often for very small amounts of remuneration to produce amazing creative works, and our society would be much worse without them. So dismantling some of the few protections they have over how that content is used and how that content is turned into income for them, it was a real point of resistance, and it was pretty quick then that the government ruled that out. And I like to think that that was a success, because there was every possibility that Australia could have followed suit and sunken to a low that others have gone to already in terms of protections for creatives, and that's not where we went. So full credit to people who mobilised on that front, and hopefully we can, if anything, strengthen and the protections available to creatives who are so important to society.
Yeah, it was a really important moment, wasn't it? Because and we played a little part in it, in that we held an emergency town hall meeting with the great Pete Garrett, personal highlight of the year for me, having him on burning platforms, but also our friends from the Writers Guild and the Screenwriters Guild. And I thought that it was an interesting moment in that an industry which is being affected up front in a very negative way, but also has a huge network of influence and an audience. I feel like they could have mobilised longer and harder, to be honest. It felt to me in the end that the wind's been banked, and I'm not sure that it's off the agenda long term, reading some of the commentary around the long-term data centre agenda. They're going to keep pushing, I think, for some form of copyright exemption. But that said, this was a group of workers who were affected by change, who got organised, and it showed that it is worth the effort. What about you, Dan?
That was almost my highlight, for what it's worth. So, it was great to see the reaction to that, although I do want to know what comes next from that, because it's worth noting that these models have all still been trained on that copyrighted material, and I don't think there's been much compensation to the artists. But anyway.
Correct. Where's the compo? Yeah. Well, we could almost go back to that a sec. Maybe before we get there, because that is the unfinished business there as well. It is. There's been a couple of cases in the States where artists have been awarded pretty minimal damages, big number, small amounts each. But that hasn't been countenanced here, has it yet?
Not that I've seen. I mean, I'm not sure if anyone else has seen that anywhere, but
yeah.
No. I mean, I think copyright protections involve lots of treaties, and your right to enforce might depend on where it's protected, and the obligations that come from a treaty. So, and where the actual training might have occurred, or the misuse of the copyrighted work. But yeah, you're right to point out that obviously the big case in this space was the Anthropic settlement for multiple billions of dollars. But however, interestingly, that has not been approved by the judge, I think, to date. So, because there's real complexity around how you resolve something like this. And I suspect it's a little unclear from the reporting, but I suspect that's something that the parties are grappling with. How much work have they done to make sure that everyone covered by this is going to be appropriately compensated? And can you satisfy the judge that this is an appropriate settlement in order for it to be approved? And so this is a real question. Anyway, sorry, Dan.
Back to your highlight.
Well, we agree on that, but I think this is probably where we're going to disagree, judging by columns from you, Peter Lewis, in The Guardian, and your emails from Digital Rights Watch, Lizzie. I'm not sure where you stand, Ed, but I guess I suspect you're also going to be against me. I think that the recent federal government's announcement on the National AI Plan is a real step in the right direction. I know.
Anyway, give me the floor. It's got to... know what's going on here.
Well, look, so give me a minute, right? And then you can all tell me why I'm wrong.
Yeah.
So
we will.
The previous approach that the government was taking was very, very risk averse, and in my mind, too risk averse. I still, I think I'm a minority here, but I believe that this technology is going to be a net benefit. There's obvious harms that come with it. I'm sure we'll talk about those in a second, but I think that the technology is going to be a net benefit. And I don't think that we need a whole new bunch of laws specifically around a technology, which is going to be literally in almost everything that we use. And I just think that the requirements that were initially being proposed were completely unworkable in a business like mine and many others, which are deploying AI in 100 different ways throughout the organisation. And so I like that there has been a change of direction to saying that let's use existing laws and then build new laws for specific harms as they come up. I just think the general approach to that is a better approach and more realistic with how the technology is actually going to be deployed. Couple more points and then I'll let you guys tell me why I'm wrong. I also like that it's encouraging data centre investment in Australia. I've been advocating that on this show for a while. I know that you disagree with me. I like the fact that fast approvals are tied to green energy for those data centres. I think that's what we need. I hate the fact that in using these models, all of the data is going offshore and therefore not subject to Australian regulations and Australian law. I think having local data centres goes some way to addressing that and giving us some sovereign control over the use of the data. I like that there's practical support for AI adoption, trying to encourage and train people up on how to use AI, how in small businesses and not-for-profits, how to use it. And I also like the establishment of the AI Safety Institute, which I think is going to do a better job of identifying the harms where they come in from the use of this technology, and therefore we can look to mitigate them. Now, there are some real harms that have come from AI. Some are already here, and existing regulation is not enough to deal with some of those harms, particularly around deepfake technology, which we can perhaps get into in a bit more detail in a second. So I'm not saying it's perfect. It's a little bit light on and lacking in detail, clearly. But I like the change of direction. I think it is more realistic, and I think that the opportunity in front of Australia is bigger than the downside risk.
One analysis I've read of it, comparing it to the Senate committee that ran the whole process last year, it's a shift from a rights-based precautionary approach to a opportunity-focused market-enabling approach. Like it to be fair, it's not pretending to be anything than what it is. What do you reckon, Ed?
Yeah, look, I suspect I'm going to end up somewhere between Dan and you and Lizzie, Pete. I think it's necessary but not sufficient, right? It does do some really important things. Our analysis for several years now has been that about 80% of the problem when it comes to AI would be most effectively addressed by just enforcing our existing laws. If you have like an endless debate about what the kind of overarching law for AI should be, what we'll probably get is an endless debate. Even in the European Union, where they've managed to actually legislate, the actual move towards enforcement has been incredibly slow. And even now, they're winding a lot of that back, or they're seriously considering winding a lot of that back. I think there's actually something quite conceptually simple and true about saying, look, we don't care what you're doing. If you're doing something sophisticated like making insurance decisions, or if you're kind of trying to find some new innovation in making widgets, you don't get some kind of regulatory or compliance discount because you happen to be using AI, but nor should you face an additional burden because you're using AI. in the vast majority of cases, right? Because so what that really means is you just need to enforce the law better. That's about 80%. The 20% is where there's genuinely novel issues. And so we've talked a lot over the last 3 years about facial recognition technology. That raises genuinely novel issues, massive concerning kind of uses of facial recognition by big retailers here in Australia, Bunnings and so on. And that really does require its own legal response. And so the thing I guess I like about the National AI Plan is that it's more realistic. It calls out the regulators several times and says we really need to sort of empower them to actually enforce the law. But also, there are about half a dozen major reforms that this plan commits to: privacy, copyright, Australian consumer law, and a few others, including in the health and medical research area. If we nailed those in this term of Parliament, we would be miles ahead of what was achieved in the last decade. So that probably won't be enough, but it would be a huge step forward. And so that's, if I'm glass half full, that's probably what I'd say about the plan.
I guess my cognitive dissonance is you're saying it's so big, it's going to be so consequential, so therefore, I guess I'll direct this at Dan, not you, Ed, but therefore you shouldn't try to control it like that. And what depresses me about this whole thing is it feels like there's an inevitability that there are going to be all these negative use cases, and we know that people want to have protections up front. We're saying it's all too hard. We're just going to let it rip and see what happens. So I want to go to Lizzie as well, obviously, but I just want to push you back on that, Dan.
Yeah, look, if that's the impression I've given you with my preamble before, it's not accurate. I don't think that it's an inevitable, unstoppable technology, and therefore we should give up trying. That's not my position at all. My point is more that it's not magical tech. It's very substantially, a substantial improvement in what we can automate now and what's possible now. But it's not magic, and therefore I think utilising the existing laws and putting new laws in place where there are novel harms, like you've mentioned, Ed, is a better approach. And I just think, you've got to remember, AI is in...
But the harms won't occur until they've happened. So isn't it Horsegate bolted?
Well, I just think that having to put in place the huge regulatory burden which was being discussed previously with Ed Santow was just... to give you some examples, right?
Was Ed Fusick actually done?
Sorry, Ed, I'm getting my head confused. My apologies. It's the end of the year. I'm going to hold that clearly. That was being discussed with Ed Fusick. Look, here's the thing. So we're deploying AI in heaps of different ways. So we're deploying AI with our coders, with our developers. We're deploying AI with our customer support team. We're developing products that use AI. There's 20, 30 different ways that we're deploying AI. And if we had to go through a ridiculous process of getting the government's approval on all of those, it would be ridiculous. It just wouldn't work. It's like saying, let's have a law for the internet. There's lots of harms that come from the internet. Let's regulate against those laws. Regulate against those harms.
Well, let's set up some grassroots or ground level responsibilities, maybe. But Lizzie, I think your main beef is that Dan's stolen your limelight with his highlight.
I don't know. Yeah, it's like yin and yang, isn't it? The problem I have with this is, we know harms will occur, right? So what is the infrastructure we put in place to get that feedback loop occurring? If you think it's going to occur and you should only address it after the fact, how do we not allow a situation where that harm is just offloaded onto everyday people and they're expected to lump it, that it actually becomes a feedback loop that is real, that mobilises against serious harm? Because it's one thing to say, the AI Safety Institute can address it. It's quite another for that to actually occur in a timely fashion. Meanwhile, these kinds of systems get embedded, right? Including, practice in how you use it or how you work with it. And I think that's what's interesting as well about the difference between, say, previous approaches to this field and then the AI plan, particularly around worker involvement. This is a Labor government. Unions are one of their key stakeholders. And the language around worker involvement and engagement on AI has really shifted towards much more about skill development and productivity benefits rather than, say, governance or feedback or involvement and consultation. And I think there's an assumption that some of that might happen, but that if that doesn't happen, it poses real problems for the efficacy, the benefit of the technology actually being realized, like as a productivity thing, but also even in terms of trust and use of the tech by others. I think if people can't see how they can be involved in some of those governance discussions as workers, and in fact, it becomes like bossware that's used to force you to do your job in a particular way and create workarounds and other inefficiencies, like you can see how we're not going to get the benefit. So it becomes this, an inevitability of not accessing that, right? So in some ways, I feel like that greater form of regulation or the different emphasis on worker engagement and participation would be more beneficial even for Dan's objective of greater take-up and rollout throughout the economy. So that's part of also my anxiety around this shift in focus and emphasis. I mean, I'll just say it again. I love reciting this, but that MIT report released a few months ago found 95% of businesses in the US with generative AI pilots were undergoing zero productivity benefits. And the key finding of that study was that worker engagement and participation in how these tools are used is a key way to reversing that, because what actually happens is enterprises just impose it from the top down and then wonder why it's not magic technology, right? So if we don't have those structures, those muscles, those consultative capabilities in place, and with the decline of unionism throughout the 20th century, we don't, right? We are poorly equipped to make use of these technologies. And I think that's a problem for the boosters as well as people who are critics.
I also think, sorry, go
brought that up one more time, Lizzie. I think I've argued with that stupidly against the findings of that report twice before, so I'll do it a third time just to round out the year. But here's my anecdotal.
Facts don't care about your feelings, Dan. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, totally. Let me give you my anecdotal retort to that, if you like, and that is that more than half of the summits, I don't know exactly what, but a large proportion of the use of AI in my organisation is being driven by, not by me, but by the team from the bottom up. So it's just not my experience, and I don't think it has to be experience.
And I also think it's the trap of looking. Maybe it's a trap, Ed, and I want to come to you with your highlight because I think it's on this as well. But to look at AI as this amorphous thing rather than a range of different applications, I've got real concerns of it as a consumer product. Like, I do not like the idea that it's just going to hit the market with my favourite term of the year, wank bots and intimate companions and agents. Like, I can see how a mindful business can deploy the fast processing of information, the uses that AI provide to create better products. I think that's interesting and good. It's just but that's not the model that's driving the industry. The model driving the industry is that everyone takes it up and makes it part of their life. And I don't think we've said we want to do that yet. Like, is this a general use technology, or should it be it's like saying everyone wants to put a nuclear reactor in their backyard and see what comes, see if they can make a bit of magic. Like, surely we can be more nuanced than that as well. And I don't think this plan does anything around the critical thinking about the way that the technology should be deployed. I feel like it's treating us like children.
I do think it reflects the stage we're at in the hype cycle. I always like to give the anecdote about Teflon. When that was developed, there were all these kind of wild prognostications about how the gentlemen of the 1960s would coat their trousers in Teflon, and they would pull them on an extra 1 or 2 seconds faster. And if you added up each of those 1 or 2 seconds is across the entire economy, the productivity benefits would be.
And if it wasn't for the chafing, it would have worked.
Indeed. And of course, it's laughable now. But a lot of the productivity, prognostications at the moment are going to be, frankly, just as laughable in a few years' time. Actually, my colleague Nick Davis has a good line for this. He says, when you look at that kind of massive disappointment on the part of companies who've invested quite heavily in AI and just not seeing the productivity gains, the way he describes it is that, they're being sold on organizational transformation, which usually means, a 20% improvement in some very important metric like efficiency or productivity or profitability. That's what they're being sold on. But what they're buying is Microsoft Copilot. And whatever you think about Microsoft Copilot, it's not the tool that will give you automatically some massive organizational transformation for the better. What most people do is they use it really idiosyncratically. And so maybe there's some benefits here and there. Maybe there are some losses here and there. Organizations actually able to harness that? Well, the vast majority haven't yet. And so that kind of massive disjuncture between the sell and the reality it's a problem, particularly for the tech companies, but it's a problem for us as well.
Is it not also a problem for a very advanced form of financialized capitalism as well? Like, in preparation for this, I was looking at some of the stats around investment because I'd sort of glossed over them in my reading previously. But there's an estimate from a Harvard economist that AI investments accounted for 92% of US GDP growth in the first half of 2025. Like, there's different estimates depending on who you read and stuff, but it's quite clearly one of the key drivers of GDP growth. And without it, GDP growth is pretty minimal in the US. And I just do wonder whether some of this is going to be not just an experiment that didn't quite work out, but actually extremely costly for a lot of people whose livelihood depends on this kind of financialized capitalism and the waste and associated with that if the bubble kind of bursts in the way that, I don't know, some of this discussion suggests it might, or if it does in ways that we can't predict, right? Like, it's not just a cost-free experiment, I suppose, is my point, that maybe it just doesn't result in these kinds of benefits that the hype guys are proposing, but it might still be some form of benefit. This is a huge orientation of the economy towards a speculative form of tech, and so far it's not delivering. That might have very real consequences for many, many, millions, potentially billions of people.
Data centers, right? That could be, exhibit one. The amount of investment, but also just the amount of energy and water use. There's a data center that's being built in the United States that's about the size of Manhattan Island. And I know, Dan, you love data centers, and you disclosed before we went on air you'd like to marry a data center.
I'm saying that, but thank you anyway. To be clear, I do like Australian data centres, yes. I do like Australian data centres.
If he's going to have a relationship with an intimate companion, it is going to come from an Australian data centre. He does not want an offshore bot.
Okay, that's my secret motivation underneath it all.
I'm just trying to score on you, Dan, so that Lizzie doesn't score on me. This is like
it's wise. It's wise.
But the point is, there could be some massive stranded assets, which is a problem for you if you've invested in it, but it's also a problem for us if all of that kind of energy and water and climate debt goes into a whole bunch of things that turns out we didn't need.
Hey, do you want to just tell us a bit more about the AI Safety Institute? Because you did list it there as your highlight, and I know a lot of people are saying, well, it's your obvious job and you don't want to embarrass you.
I would not be working at the Australian AI Safety Institute.
So, is it going to have teeth, and is it got is 25 mil or whatever enough? Like, we've been talking about how big this industry is. It seems like it's like I don't know, it's a lot of money for me, but it doesn't seem like a lot of money for a
Yeah. I mean, Lizzie, as a corporate lawyer, doesn't go out of bed for $25 million.
That sounds legit. Okay, now he's turning on me. You're going to talk about later, Ed.
Spraying everywhere. The thing I like about the AI Safety Institute is that it would not do what you've just alluded to, Pete. It's there to provide technical guidance or technical kind of assistance particularly for government, particularly for regulators. And just a little anecdote on this, there have been some really significant enforcement actions in Australia when it comes to AI. We've talked on Burning Platforms before about the work that the Privacy Commissioner has done on facial recognition and a number of other areas. The ACCC did a really important case a few years ago against Trivago, where they were basically using the algorithm in a way that was misleading and deceptive against their own customers. Now, they couldn't have run that case under their own steam. They didn't have the technical. They had some amazing people at the ACCC, but they didn't have the full suite of technical expertise that they needed in-house. They didn't have access to it anywhere in government. They ended up having to go to Quantium, which is, it's a company that provides, AI and data science consultancy services to all of the big companies in Australia, and so that the fact that expertise isn't available, that's a massive, massive problem for us in Australia. And so what the government has decided to do is to create that resource so that they don't just have to go outside of government to get it. So the budget will be about $7.5 million a year for the first 4 years. That's what they've kind of allocated to it so far. And that's not nearly enough, no question, right? Like that is a tiny proportion of what the UK's equivalent institute has. And they augment that many times over with, philanthropic money and other sources of funding. But it's a start. And the need to have, that real core expertise that can push back on unmeritorious claims from industry and people who want to do the wrong thing, that is crucially important.
I'm still not sure about the teeth or the capacity, but I guess that'll be.
It's not meant to have teeth. It's meant to. It gives teeth, I guess you could say,
to the laws that we don't have because they're not bringing in laws.
Well, no, but the point. Well, sure, I take what you're saying there. But if you're a regulator that wants to say, look, if you're using AI to be misleading and deceptive, that's unlawful. But you get to the point where you go, I actually, I've got all this information from the company.
I can't prove it. Yeah,
doing the wrong thing, but it's all ones and zeros. I can't make sense of it. You become the dog that caught the car, and so giving regulators a source of expertise that can actually help them make sense of the lawfulness or otherwise of conduct. I can't emphasize how important that is. And at the moment, that
as long as it's not being highlighted as being more than it is, because when I read the government's justification, like some of the speeches, it's like, this is the cop on the beat, and you're telling me that's not actually what it is. So I think and
it's not been that in any of the countries that have already created their safety institute. They've got different names in different countries, but basically there's a network of about a dozen. And no, it's not the cop, but it supports the cops.
Cool. We've been pretty off-brand and spent half an hour talking about the glass being half full. What about the bad stuff that's happened this year? What's your low light of the year, Lizzie?
Oh, I feel pretty depressed about Sora, I have to tell you, because to me it's kind of an astonishingly bad faith dissemination of technology. I keep asking people what the use case is for this, and I don't know, Sam Altman now seems kind of open about it, that it'll be used for adult content, sexualized content. And I find it just really depressing that, the Australian government entered into its first procurement contract with OpenAI, obviously the makers of both ChatGPT and Sora, at the same time as they're trying to prohibit nudify apps. And they, at the same time as OpenAI put out Sora, which with, at the time, not quite an explicit ambition of facilitating the creation of adult content, but eventually moving towards it. And I think Sora is a prime candidate for technology that's going to be used to create non-consensual sex-based imagery. I don't know, Julian Mungrant's got the correct terminology for this. Non-consensual, intimate imagery and video. God, I know. Anyway, I just don't want to say the incorrect terminology, but the point is, I think they're going to create awful content that does not involve people consenting to use it. And what's our responsibility in contracting with the company that does that behaves so irresponsibly in that way? I find it really depressing. Like they haven't got really any agenda of working out what a social license might look like, or even what the boundaries of use might look like, let alone like moderating how people might use the technology or making any attempt to do it in any meaningful way or having guardrails. And I just don't know how it's okay that we allow a company like this to carry on as though that's not going to cause significant harm. So I find that to be a bit of a low light.
What about you, Dan? What's your down moment?
I've ranted about this before, but one more time with feeling, and that is the Velvet Sundown and AI music in general is just wretched in my view. And it's worse than it just being inhuman. What's worse is that I think, Lizzie, you shared a story around which I'd read I think a day earlier this week or last week around King Gizzard taking their content off Spotify in protest against Daniel Ek's investment in a military company, and yet, a few days later, there was effectively AI-generated versions of their music that was just different enough that they probably couldn't sue for copyright infringement, but was pretty damn close. And I just think, is this really where we want to get to, where artists are effectively just trading data? Now that's all they are. And I had this really terrible, disturbing thing happen over the weekend, where my son, who's recently on Spotify, he's 13, he's starting to get into music in a big way, playing in a band.
It's the only platform he can get onto now, Dan.
Well, yes, he wasn't on any before this band came in, but anyway. But he asked me to put on a song as we were driving somewhere, and for Spotify, and I did. And I was like, mate, who is this artist? I can't remember the name of them, to be honest. I've never heard of them. And he told me, I was like, oh, mate, where'd they come from? And he didn't know much about it. He's like, I don't know. He said, they came up in one of the Spotify playlists for me this week. And so I did some research on it, and it's a completely AI-generated artist. And so, and by the way, when I told my son that, he was horrified and will never listen to it again, thankfully. So, but I just make the point, like, this is the economics of this now, right? So Spotify have to share all the revenue or a portion of the significant portion of the revenue back with the record labels of the artists that are played on their platform. But they don't have to do that with AI-generated content, right? So, and there's so many people who just put on a Spotify playlist without thinking about it. And, maybe 1/3 of that will be real music and from real artists, and maybe 2/3 will be AI, and maybe most people won't care. But it just makes the whole thing putrid and undermines the whole artistic endeavour, and I can't think of anything worse.
I still have time for the guy who generated a whole bunch of AI songs and then generated an AI to listen to the AI songs and then took revenue off Spotify. He's the hero for the moment, in my view.
Well, that's a good deployment of the tech. Yeah, I'll take that one.
But it is interesting that the applications that are going mainstream and into people's lives, not into their working life, but into their cultural life, are really extractive, exploitative, and crap. And there's an argument that says, well, we should just stop using these platforms, and you get into the whole network effect that we're reliant on them because we invested time in them. But just for my low light before I go to Ed, and I've been sort of thinking about, I do think the idea that you're soon going to have OpenAI with advertising embedded and what that does to particularly to sources of truth and, processing of information is really, really concerning. But I've got lots of things making me feel down at the moment, and time is moving on. What's your low light, Ed?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I wasn't going to say this, but I do think that increasing pollution of our information environment. We see that in a world where Trump is president of the United States, Putin is president of Russia, and the list goes on. I'm a human rights person. We often talk about freedom of expression or free speech as the right to be able to say what you want, and that's true. But it's also about the right to be able to receive information that allows you to form rational opinions. That's always been the kind of corollary of freedom of expression. It's in the ICCPR. It's really important, and increasingly we're seeing in families as well as online. We're seeing people just sort of being picked off one by one as they kind of fully immerse in conspiracy theories and just bullshit. And it's terrible. It's really, really scary and awful. And then maybe if I link that to this phenomenon, I know that you were musing about this before, Pete, about the start of the year, you had the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, come to the big AI Action Summit in France, and basically kind of do
You
this.
were there, weren't you? Or were you there at
Yeah.
the pre-conference? So
Yeah, no, I was there.
You and
I can do
JD. Yeah.
Good impression of Macron, if you like.
Yes, please.
I want a JD Vance impression.
Yeah, I can't do him, but I
You're not
will
that
do
messed up,
Macron if we
yeah.
have time. But
got
essentially,
time,
it was
Ed.
just like this massive, muscular, kind of haranguing of all of these kind of lily-livered civil society people like me, basically saying, we're not talking about, regulation anymore. We're not talking about doing the right thing anymore. This is an arms race, and we are here to win. And what that actually means is a massive threat that they've actually acted on to impose tariffs on target countries that want to do nothing more than just the basic role of being a government, which is to protect the people. And, countries like Australia aren't always going to get it right. But it's the nature of being a sovereign country that you get to make rules to protect your people. And now we have countries, including Australia, who are so fearful of that it is bending out of shape some of the most important parts of public policy in the tech space.
Yeah, I did read through that speech in prepping for the show, and it did strike me the narrative is very consistent with where the Australia's National AI Plan has landed, notwithstanding, obviously, the government's brought in the social media ban, which is sort of counter to regulating American tech companies. But on the big game of AI, I feel like the shift is, I'm not saying it's causation, but it's definitely been a correlation with the change in America. And also, the amping up of the lobbying influence in Australia of the tech sector, which is probably the other story of 2025, which we could go into if we were feeling like naming names, but we might not for this week.
Can I do my Macron impression?
Yes, please.
Yeah,
Yes, please.
Okay. So, in America, you say drill, baby, drill. But here in France, we say plug, baby, plug. You bring your data centers here, and we will be the center of the world. There you go.
That's done more to
That's a bit
turn me
more
off building
Gerard
data centers than
Depardieu
anything else I've heard.
than Macron. That feels
it's
a bit
right.
different.
French. Depardieu is actually French. If you'd said it was Inspector Clouseau or some English person, but it had been French, I would have been really upset. But I'll take any French
diplomatique.
So, apart from deploying Ed to poison the case for data centers in Australia, what are the big challenges in 2026? Like, what should we? I guess the other point, just to round out the lowlights, is I feel, notwithstanding Dan, who is in the tech industry, is I feel like we lost. We lost the year pretty badly. I think a lot of our arguments either got stuck, notwithstanding one good defensive play on copyright. I think any fair assessment of where the AI plan landed, it wasn't where civil society wanted it to land, wasn't where the unions wanted it to land. And I feel like we were totally outgunned by the lobbyists who have really inside ties to Labor, by the industry that's got a network of economic modelists and peak organisations that are driving and winning the narrative. And I feel like we're being smashed. So if we're thinking about I'm not going to call them fights, but what are the issues that we need to be thinking about for 2026, if we are going to be effective, what are they, so that we're not just a reactive group who just get angry every week?
I'll put one forward,
Lizzie?
which is Ed knows lots about this and may wish to comment, but there is a bill before the New South Wales Parliament which is about quote unquote surveillance technologies, but it's actually about AI systems and how they're deployed in workplaces. Huge numbers of AI systems are trained on employee data, which is, at least in Australia, got an exemption from the Privacy Act. And this bill is, I think, an attempt to put some balance towards workers, to say that if it's going to be used to make pretty significant decisions about them, that there has to be some checks and balances. And if there's a suspected breach, that you get a right to inspect the system. Now, I think that's interesting an interesting initiative. Ed and I were also at an event earlier this year where Chrissy Lynch from the AFL-CIO in Massachusetts came out, and she's got a bill which sets a shopping list of similar kinds of demands on how AI systems should not be used to make significant decisions like hiring and firing decisions without oversight, without the right to challenge the decision, without it being fair, right? So there's a set of conditions that, in the absence of regulation at a federal level, may end up appearing in workplace agreements and or state-based legislative regimes, whatever it may be, because that is one way in which policy change happens. Like, people may not know, but like a few years ago, there was no such thing as domestic violence leave. Now it's a common feature in workplace agreements around the country, because the union movement took a lead on this and understood it was important to give people the right to have leave when they're trying to get out of a situation of domestic violence. And I think the union movement can do the same thing, be the leading edge of a set of obligations on how these systems might be used at work that will potentially have great benefits for everybody else who has to have decisions made about them by these systems, but also even in workplaces that aren't covered by agreements. It can be a way in which that rising tide lifts all boats.
Mm. Ed, what are you looking at in 2026 as being the hills to die on?
I'm really with Lizzie on that. I think the kind of focus on what AI means for workers, starting with that New South Wales bill, which was introduced by the government. They have said that they're completely committed to it. The term that's actually used is digital work systems. So it starts with things that we will have, observed. If you're an Uber driver, you never have a human boss, but you're given work by essentially an algorithm. And those systems have to be accountable in the way that if you had a human boss, she or he would be. It's a pretty basic expectation, but our law is not clear enough on that. And so I think it's gutsy, not in the kind of, yes, minister sense of gutsy. It's a good form of gutsiness that they're doing that. The other thing is, the Albanese government, right since they were first elected in 2022, has essentially told the Australian public we're not going to be the most ambitious government when it comes to the commitments we make, but we're going to be held to those commitments. And so when it comes to the National AI Plan, I'm sympathetic to a lot of the criticisms, but there is good stuff in there. And so I think, if we can hold in 2026, if we can hold the Albanese government to actually making good on those commitments, that will be an important step forward in protecting Australians from harmful uses of AI. And so we should bloody do it. And if it turns out, as I would predict, that's not quite enough, then have that debate at that point.
So if we're here in a year's time and you're back and it's the 2026 year in review, what are the 2 or 3 things you'd want to have seen them land over the next 12 months, Ed?
What are the 2 or 3? So I think it's privacy, copyright, and the consumer law protections, which includes giving regulators the extra powers they need to make sure that they can actually see what's going on.
The other one that I'm interested in is the that expansion of workplace health and safety, just because I think it's a really elegant way of building responsibility on businesses that deploy new technology to do the good things that companies like Dan's will do, but also then not leave him at a disadvantage to the charlatans. But this is all talking about how we regulate the ecosystem, but also what are you looking for in 2026, Dan? What do you want to see?
Yeah, I would make the point, by the way, that despite working in tech, I agree with everything that everyone's just said. There is something that needs to be done, right? So it's not as if that the harms aren't there and that there isn't a massive change going on that needs to be carefully managed. So I just would make that point. And particularly, I mean, you touched on this, Ed, with privacy. I mean, I think I've talked about this for a long time. We've all talked about this for a long time. The government made a small bit of progress on this, but there's obviously a lot more to go. I think this is particularly important next year, by the way. The reason is, and again, it comes back to AI, sorry to sound like a broken record, but it's worth noting that these large language models, they've effectively run out of training data now, right? So it's I mean, there'll always be more, there'll be news, there'll be all those sort of things that they can use to do it. But, they've effectively sucked up the internet now and sucked up most of what's been produced by humans over time to use to train these models. And so the concern now is that they're going to be trying to have to get data from the real world, particularly when it comes to robotics, to make robotics work. And I think if we don't have privacy protections in place that protect people in the real world, we're going to be in real strife. I think that it's becoming more urgent, not less urgent, because of the rise of AI. And so I think that's, it's really unfinished business, privacy, right? Like they've got to get their skates on and resolve this.
But also, we also know that if they go privacy, there will be a reaction from all the same interests as always to make it really, really hard. I don't have huge faith.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I just think that's what does need to happen. The other thing which may be more tangible, and I think has probably got a chance of getting up, is outlawing deepfakes. David Pocock's got a really interesting call, making really interesting calls lately for strong legal protections for people's identity and effectively outlawing the use of deepfakes without appropriate consent. And I think, and Kate Cheney's had something similar when it comes to child sexually explicit material. So I think, that's a pretty small, tangible thing, which I think most people would agree on. It also potentially, Lizzie, stops apps like Sora actually getting a foothold. I just think that seems like a pretty sensible thing for Australia to do. Pocock's already advocating for it. I'd love to see the government take it up.
An interesting observation from our conversation that in neither the lowlights, the highlights, or what comes next lights, we've mentioned the social media ban, which is sort of held up as this big globally significant intervention. It's been in for all of a week. I know, taken up a lot of oxygen in terms of discussions around technology, sends parents a message the government's really serious about tech. Starting with you, Lizzie, I know you're probably the most sceptical of it in the room, but has it been an exercise that's a net benefit, net deficit? How have you looked at that in the context of the broader?
Yeah, I mean, I do think in some ways it poses this kind of utilitarian versus human rights approach. Like, if you think there's going to be the greatest good for the greatest number in prohibiting under 16s from accessing social media, maybe you're prepared to tolerate the harm that might come to other groups associated with the policy. I mean, that's not how I think. I sort of think if you're going to impose a policy with a particular mission in mind, you need to think about the consequences of it and whether the limitations, the impositions on people's rights are appropriately tailored and necessary. There's protections for them. And then you've got to constantly be referring back to the ambition that the policy is centered around. And I just don't think it meets that test. I think it's also really telling that we're not even going into this with kind of a sense that we should be measuring or calibrating or asking questions about whether it's useful or not. Like, it's not as though there's this bold ambition to work out whether it's going to be a success and measuring young people's well-being and the like, and listening to them in the way that you would hope if it was being treated with more of the seriousness that I think it deserves. It just does feel to me like a triumph of politics over policy. This is a very appealing policy with the electorate. I think a lot of people do have reservations about it. And the more workarounds there are, the more difficulties there are with implementation. I think some of that popularity will start to ebb away because the big claim is that this is doing something, and kids might still be struggling in a year's time and struggling for all sorts of different reasons. And there's just I just think there's a real potential here for the outcomes to be manipulated in ways that don't reflect good policy making in process or substance. So, I just don't think this is, I've got objections to it. I just really hope actually that kids who are experiencing harm as a result of this policy being implemented are being looked after. And if there's kids in your life, you should ask them about it. And hopefully kids also remember that if they're on social media and they shouldn't be and they're having a bad time, they're not breaking the law, and that they should go and talk to adults in their life that they trust. So what I would really hope is that people take the opportunity to have conversations about how you can have good experiences online and what to do if you're having bad experiences. And again, I just sort of worry that the framing of the policy isn't pushing people in that direction. But that would be that's my main concern at this point in time, at least.
You both have kids in the hitting zone, Ed and Dan. What are the conversations in your house been like?
My daughter is well, she's just turned 16 actually, so it doesn't apply. But she's
Happy days.
And my son, who's 13, has never asked for it, so never asked for social media. He knows we'd say no, so I guess it makes it easier. I mean, look, for me, the jury is out on this policy. I'd like to see how it plays out. You know, I'm supportive of it in principle. I've been convinced, I think, by your argument, mostly Lizzie, that this effectively absolves the platforms have taken responsibility for the harms that their platforms create, and therefore, really, we should be starting there rather than just restricting children from being able to use it. But maybe this is just a more pragmatic way of dealing with those harms and will be more effective. And I'm also concerned about the privacy implications of verifying people online. But I'm probably less concerned of that over time with how it looks like it's being rolled out. But I think we should talk about it on our last show of 2026 and see how we feel about it.
Mm-hmm. And Ed, any thoughts on the ban?
I think I feel the same way as Dan. I think not on this podcast, but so much of this debate, you end up having to pick a side. Like, you either minimise the harms that happen for young people online via social media, or you do the opposite, and I hate both of those things. This is really messy reform, messy policy. It's not going to work all the time, but that doesn't deny the fact that there's a real problem to be solved.
Very good. Well, winding down, just to sum, I'm just interested in any books people are planning to read, any recommendations otherwise. I have been very upfront that I am following a tip from Lizzie at some point that I really have to read Ursula Le Guin, who writes science fiction, fantasy in a way that isn't what blokes normally read. What should I expect, Lizzie? Like, I at some point I've hatched onto this, and I'm quite a compulsive character. But
I love that Ursula Le Guin is just like science fiction for the ladies.
Yeah. No, I didn't say that. I did not say that. I said it was a less masculine vision of the future. So,
she herself says, she's often
all three on the panel. Good.
She's often criticised as not being science fiction or whatever because her books don't involve hard things that are used to bash and kill. Like, that's her framing, which I think is valid, right? Like, she's got a different theory of how it is you interrogate the relationship between science, technology, and humanity, and I think it's more astute. So it doesn't surprise me that that's the conclusion that's drawn. So I'm curious to see what you make of that, Peter. I want to read Cory Doctorow's book called Enshittification, because I'm always astonished at Cory Doctorow's the extent to which he's so prolific in producing information or writing and high quality analysis. And I think even if you don't agree with everything he says, I think he really does ask you to think about questions in new ways. And I'm excited to see this latest contribution.
And because he doesn't believe in copyright, you can listen to it free on Spotify, but he's reading it. And can I tell you, it's an intense experience. It is like...
Is it like Ed's... Ed can do an impression of Cory Doctorow.
Next after summer, yeah. That'd be
pretty interesting about the publication of this book, by the way. You've had Cory Doctorow basically on every single podcast going for ages, and he's a pretty captivating and compelling bit talent. Slightly mad at times, but you can't help but keep listening to him. So it's on my reading list too, for what it's worth, Lizzie.
What else have you got, Dan?
I'm going back to one which I've actually read before, but I've literally got it off the bookshelf to read it again, and it's called The Constitution of Knowledge by Jonathan Rauch. And I'm picking this book up because he's brilliant, by the way. He writes for The Atlantic and a whole bunch of other people. But he wrote this book and he published it in 2021, which was just before ChatGPT came out. And it was all about how the knowledge and the information system was breaking down and how there were no experts anywhere and no commitment to the truth and the importance of the journalistic enterprise and whatever else, and how that was breaking down. And I just think it is so much more relevant now in an age of AI slop and the ability for this very polluted information ecosystem to just become an absolute sewer soon. And I think, so I think that's one I'm going to read. I'm also, by the way, going to attempt to read Empire of AI by Karen Howe, which I think gives some apparently pretty interesting insights into Sam
It's
Altman's
an
ambition.
absolute cracker, Dan. I can totally recommend that one. Fantastic. And Ed, you're in a book club, aren't you?
All male book club.
So what are the men reading? What are the
Ursula Le Guin.
Yeah, exactly. No, I want to read this summer. I want to read as little tech stuff as possible. The honest answer. My partner was saying to me the other day, our 10-year-old, he's not going to want to be read to much longer. And I have this lovely memory of my dad reading to me Sherlock Holmes. So maybe the real answer is that I'll probably be reading Sherlock Holmes as my 10-year-old, which would be actually really nice. I am finding I try to read all of the books that are kind of important in tech as they come out during the year. But the things that really, really sort of stick with me and the things that I find help me generate interesting ideas tend to be really, really old. I like reading Dickens. I like reading kind of old books, and I actually think that kind of cross-fertilization is really important. I think it's also important to give yourself some time away from the institutification, all of the things that might make us a bit depressed. That said, I do want to read Robert Caro. I've got here the first installment of his, I think it's trilogy on Lyndon Johnson.
That's meant to be an all-time classic, yeah.
Yeah, so I've started reading it, and I'm not I don't read biographies obsessively, but it's brilliantly written, and yeah, LBJ not a great guy. Although I think that might be a bit reductive.
Well, 600 page volumes, and Ed's given you the summary, the spoiler alert. It's fantastic. Well, as someone who also wrote that Santa's not that good a guy, I reckon. So I reckon we're done. Thanks, guys. It's been a fantastic year. I feel like we've sort of grown this thing, grown a bit of a community around it, and it's just been great having you all along for the ride. So for you, Liz, Dan, Ed, Danny, and all our listeners as well, thanks for being part of it in 2025. I think we're going to have a bit of a breakthrough, Jan, and sort of regroup sometime around Australia Day and see if the world's still viable proposition or not, and see what happens next. But on that note, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year.
Thanks, folks. It has been good. I also want to say big thanks to everyone who came to the live podcasts that we did around the country.
That was my highlight. I didn't get it in. My highlight of the year was going on the road.
I think. But
it was great fun.
It was so good to sort of see that there are people out there that are actually engaged in this conversation.
People other than my mum who listen to the show. It's great.
Well, my wife doesn't even listen to it, so it was good to see this.
She didn't come to the event either, to be fair, Dan. All the drinks after.
No, I'm used to that.
Yeah. See you guys. You've been listening to Burning Platforms. It was recorded on December 15 and produced on Naarm land by Rebecca Cannell. Talk again in 2026.